Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the mad godlike Phyrexian Solphim Mayhem Dominus. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commander we'll be covering next, who won last week's poll, and what commander you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Solphim Mayhem Dominus is a 5/4 Phyrexian horror that costs 2 and double red and has the following abilities. Firstly, whenever a source we control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, it deals double damage to that player or permanent instead. And secondly, we can pay 2 Phyrexian red mana and discard 2 cards to put an indestructible counter on Solphim Mayhem Dominus. Breaking down her core stats, Solphim is sporting a mid-weight CMC, an above-average stat block for her cost, and a pair of abilities that not only empower all the non-combat damage we deal to our opponents and their permanents by simply existing, but also allows us to make her immune to most conventional types of removal to make it significantly harder for our opponents to interact with her. Taking a closer look at her first ability, it effectively makes her a cheaper, one-sided and non-combat-oriented Angrath's Marauders that we always have access to from the command zone, immediately doubling the damage output of all our burn and direct damage sources by simply existing on the battlefield, which luckily for us, Mono Red has plenty of access to thanks to being the primary color for such effects, and that's in addition to having a decent number of other damage amplifying effects in its arsenal that combine well with Solphim to make our damage potential even more impressive. Though while we're on the subject of damage amplification, it should be noted that when using multiple types of these effects, it's the effect's target, not us, that gets to pick the order in which they resolve, which may or may not result in less damage depending on the effects in question. For example, if we cast Lightning Bolt targeting an opponent with both Solphim and City on Fire in play, the former having the spell deal double damage while the latter has it deal triple damage, the opponent we target with it would get to choose which multiplier to apply first. Though in this instance there would be no difference since both 3 × 2 × 3 and 3 × 3 × 2 both equal 18 damage. But if we were to swap City on Fire for Torbrand Thane of Redfell instead, who adds 2 damage to the spell, our opponents would then have the option to apply his damage modification before Solphim's, increasing the damage to 5, then multiplying it by 2, resulting in 10 damage, or after Solphim's, increasing the damage to 6, then adding 2, resulting in 8 damage. So always be sure to keep that in mind, especially if you're calculating for lethal and have multiple types of these effects in play simultaneously. Then moving on to Solphim's second ability, it simply provides our commander with very cheap and easy to enable protection against most common types of damage removal and wipes, typically only costing us 1 mana, 4 life, and the worst 2 cards in our hand, meaning we can theoretically get this online as soon as she comes down if we have a single mana left over, and while yes, we are pitching 2 potential resources from our hand in order to activate this, it's a small price to pay for us not only permanently rendering our commander immune to very common removal spells and wipes in our format, but also gives us an indestructible 5/4 blocker to intercept attacks for us while she just stands there on the battlefield menacingly, empowering all our non-combat damage as she does so. So, as we probably guessed based on her abilities, Solphim is most certainly a burn-themed commander, aiming to drop quickly onto the battlefield, be made indestructible, then empower all our burn spells and effects until our opponent's life totals are reduced to cinders. So it should come as no surprise that this is exactly the direction we'll be taking this build, with us running plenty of AoE burn spells and effects, some of which may hurt us but will hurt our opponents more, some more passive sources of AoE burn and damage to soften up our opponents while we wait to play our bigger burn spells to finish them off, payoffs as we cast our spells to inflict even more damage to our opponent's life totals, and a handful of additional damage amplifiers to ensure all the damage we deal hurts our opponents as much as possible until their life totals turn to ash under our fiery onslaught. So let us make our way to New Phyrexia and gaze in awe and horror at our commander, the Domini Solphim. She is metal given form, more akin to a force of nature than a Phyrexian. An imposing presence of hardened steel and molten iron wreathed in a gown of spears that towers over the mountains themselves, rendering her a magnificent, nightmarish, and utterly alien sight to behold. She does not speak, but is surrounded by her commands carved into the metallic mountains of Mirrodin by her molten appendages, each a litany of madness, horror, and contradictions more harrowing than the last, her thoughts and will being as otherworldly as her appearance. But whether she be mad, unknowable, or even aware of us at all, her power is undeniable and ours to use as we see fit. Or, just perhaps, she's the one who's using us. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Beginning in the CMC 1 slot, we have its singular entrant, Sawblade Scamp, a 1/1 with haste that, whenever we cast a non-creature spell, gains an oil counter, and we can tap and remove an oil counter from it to have it deal 1 damage to each opponent, making it the first of many non-creature spell payoffs we'll be running to inflict AoE burn to our opponents as we cast the majority of our spells. And, while its damage is low and limited to once per turn, when combined with our commander and other damage amplifying effects, it can soften up our opponent's life totals quite nicely before we deliver the finishing blow with our more powerful burn spells. Then continuing on this trend of passive AoE burn, the CMC 2 slot consists entirely of entrants that do just that, starting with Firebrand Archer and Kessig Flamebreather, who deal 1 damage to each opponent whenever we cast a non-creature spell and are a 2/1 and a 1/3 respectively, Electrostatic Field, a 0/4 defender that deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, and Thermo Alchemist, a 0/3 defender that we can tap to deal 1 damage to each opponent and untaps whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, all of which help us whittle down our opponent's life totals even further as we cast our non-creature spells, instants, and sorceries, which is where most of our damage is coming from anyway. The CMC 3 slot then opens up with yet another source of passive AoE burn, Gutter Snipe, a 2/2 that deals 2 damage to each opponent whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, dealing a hefty 4 burn alongside our commander as we cast roughly a quarter of our deck to continue piling on the damage. We then close out this slot with some core stat improving sources of burn in the form of the Devil's Pain Distributor and Sin Prodder. Pain Distributor is a 2/3 with Menace that, whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, creates a treasure token for them, and, whenever an artifact an opponent controls is sent to the graveyard from the battlefield, deals 1 damage to that player, making it a decent source of ramp that, while symmetrical, does force our opponents to shock themselves in the face if they want to use the treasure it gives them. Sin Prodder is a 3/2 with Menace that, on our upkeep, has us reveal the top card of our deck, then allows any opponent to take damage equal to its CMC to send it to our graveyard, and, if no one does, puts it into our hand, serving as a passive source of card advantage and or burn that will get harder and harder for our opponents to pay for as their life totals start dwindling. It's the CMC 4 slot then up next, which will start off with another trio of burn-focused creatures, those being Defiler of Instinct, Tectonic Giant, and Fanatic of Mogus. Defiler of Instinct is a 4/4 with First Strike that, whenever we cast a red permanent spell, lets us reduce that spell's cost by 1 red pip by paying 2 life, in addition to also letting us deal 1 damage to any target whenever we cast a red permanent spell. Its ability to basically convert a red mana symbol into a Phyrexian red mana, speeding up the rate at which we can cast our creatures, enchantments, planeswalkers, and battles, and the free shock it provides while Solphim is on board being a nice little bonus to deal with small utility creatures or get some extra burn in. Tectonic Giant is a 3/4 that, whenever it attacks or is targeted by an opponent's spell, has us choose one of the following effects. Either it deals 3 damage to each opponent, or it exiles the top 2 cards of our deck, has us choose one, and lets us play that card until the end of our next turn, making it both a decent piece of AoE burn, dealing 6 damage to the table alongside Solphim, and a source of repeatable card advantage that allows us to dig deeper into our deck for even more burn and payoffs. Fanatic of Mogus is a 4/2 that, when it ETBs, deals damage to each opponent equal to our devotion to red, which between it and our commander alone deals 6 damage to each opponent after being doubled, and only gets better on more established boards to absolutely demolish our opponent's life totals. We then have a pair of legendary entrants wrapping up the CMC 4 slot, namely Toralf, God of Fury, and Torbran, Thane of Redfell. Torolf is an MDFC whose front face is a 5/4 trampler that, whenever a creature or planeswalker is dealt excess non-combat damage, deals damage equal to that excess damage to any other target, thereby allowing us to get an enormous amount of extra damage out of our AoE damage dealing board wipes to potentially end the game on the spot, and whose back face, Torolf's Hammer, is an equipment that costs 1 in a red, equips for 1 in a red, grants the equipped creature +3/+0 if it's legendary, and lets us pay 1 a red, tap the equipped creature, and return the hammer to our hand to have it deal 3 damage to any target, making it a mana-intensive but repeatable bolt that, if we have the excess mana, we can generally use to deal 6 damage to creatures or face while we wait for the opportunity to summon Torolf and end the game. Torbrand is a 2/4 that, whenever a source we control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent they control, has it deal that much damage +2 instead, making him the first of many damage amplifiers we'll be running alongside our commander to further increase the lethality of our burn spells, and, since he empowers all damage, makes our creatures deadlier as well if we have the opportunity to attack in with them. Nearing the end now, the CMC 5 slot brings us a fresh pair of non-combat damage dealers with Brash Taunter and Heartless Hidetsugu. Brash Taunter is a 1/1 with Indestructible that, whenever it's dealt damage, deals that much damage to target opponent, and we can pay 2 a red and tap it to have it fight another target creature, giving us another indestructible blocker to intercept attacks for us alongside Solphim, which then redirects any damage it takes back to our opponent's faces, as well as a once per turn fight effect that we can use to pick off small creatures or instead slam into our commander for even more burn. Heartless Hidetsugu is a 4/3 that we can tap to have it deal damage to target player equal to half their life total rounded down, which will instantly eliminate an opponent while Solphim is in play if they have an even life total or leave them at 1 otherwise, making him a kill on sight creature that will either force our opponents to waste removal on him or risk losing the game. The CMC 6 slot then brings us our penultimate creature entry, that being Chandra's Incinerator, a 6/6 trampler that costs X less to cast, where X is equal to the amount of non-combat damage dealt to our opponents that turn, and whenever a source we control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker they control, allowing it to hit the board quickly thanks to all our burn, and then weaponizing that burn by tacking on removal to it, which again gets doubled up by our commander to take out all but the biggest targets. And finally, reaching the CMC 7 slot and our last creature, we have Angrath's Marauders, a 4/4 that, if a source we control would deal damage to a permanent or player, has it deal double that damage instead, more or less making it an extra copy of our commander in the 99 to increase our damage output even further, but also amplifies any damage we take from our own AoE burn too, so we may want to be careful with it. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Starting off in the CMC 1 slot, we only have a singular entrant joining us, Lightning Bolt, which deals 3 damage to any target, usually being cranked up to 6 by our commander, which makes it a solid piece of spot removal or burn for only a single mana. The CMC 2 slot is then up next, opening with a pair of X spells, Comet Storm and Electro Dominance. Comet Storm has multi-kicker 1, has us choose a target plus another target for every time it was kicked, and deals X damage to each of them, providing the build with a scalable finisher that we can pump all our mana into to hit all our opponents simultaneously for a huge amount of burn, all at flash speed to boot. Electro Dominance deals X damage to any target, then lets us cast a card of CMC X or less from our hand without paying its mana cost. This time only burning down a singular opponent and or dealing with a singular threat, but making up for it by letting us get a free spell off the back of it and triggering any cast triggers when we do so, of which we have plenty. It's then on to some more traditional burn spells in the form of Price of Progress, which deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands they control, inflicting heavy damage to multicolored decks with expensive mana bases, while leaving us mostly untouched due to us primarily running basics, and Smash to Smithereens, which destroys target artifact, then deals 3 damage to its controller, giving the build solid back row removal against a common threat type that also tacks on some decent burn as a bonus, and both of these burn spells becoming even deadlier when combined with Solphim and all our other damage amplifying abilities. Then wrapping up the CMC 2 slot, we have the non-burn spells Abrade and Thrill of Possibility. Abrade either has us deal 3 damage to target creature or destroy target artifact, making it a flexible removal option that gets upgraded so long as our commander's around to deal with much bigger creatures, while still giving us the option to pop back row as well. Thrill of Possibility has us discard a card to draw 2, which we're running in the build as a cheap and flash speed means to pitch dead cards so we can dig for our burn spells and payoffs, while also proccing said payoffs for some additional damage as well. Then momentarily staying away from burn spells as we enter the CMC3 slot, we have the removal spell Chaos Warp, which shuffles target permanent back into its owner's deck, then has them reveal the top card from it, letting them put it into play if it's a permanent, which doesn't really contribute to the burn game plan, but still provides excellent non-destruction removal to deal with almost any type of permanent threat we may encounter, which can sometimes proc our spell payoffs to get some incidental burn in too. Then it's back to burn spells as we close out this slot with Risk Factor and Volcanic Fallout. Risk Factor has Jumpstart and either allows target opponents to have it deal 4 damage to them, or, if they don't, lets us draw 3 cards, which when bumped up to 8 damage effectively puts the opponents of our choice in a position where either they take a fifth of their starting life total in damage, or provide us with significant card advantage, either of which is good for us and lets us do so twice per game thanks to Jumpstart. Volcanic Fallout can't be countered and deals 2 damage to each creature and each player, making it a decent instant speed mini-wipe and AoE burn spell when empowered to clear the board of all but the biggest creatures while inflicting some extra burn into our opponents. And lastly, reaching the CMC4 slot and our final pair of instants, we have Big Score and Unexpected Windfall, both of which have us discard a card to draw 2 and create 2 treasure tokens, providing us with some more card selection to help us dig deeper into our deck for the spells and payoffs we need to finish off our opponents, while also ramping us via treasure, which is always nice to have access to for our inevitable Nova turn where we attempt to burn down all our opponents simultaneously and could use the extra mana. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Opening in the CMC1 slot, we start off with the scalable wipes and AoE burn spells Earthquake and Rolling Earthquake, both of which are X spells that deal X damage to each creature and each player, the former not hitting creatures with flying and the latter not hitting creatures with horsemanship instead, both serving as powerful finishers that we can pump huge amounts of mana into to burn out all our opponents in one fell swoop, or that we can instead use to retake control of the board that our indestructible commander can live through while giving us some incidental burn as we use them. We then close out this slot with the non-burn spell Faithless Looting, which has flashback and lets us draw 2, then discard 2, giving our build one last piece of card selection that allows us to pitch dead cards for hopefully better ones while proccing our spell payoffs and being usable twice per game. Burn is then back on the menu as we move on to the first half of the CMC2 slot with its 2 entrants, Flame Rift and Jaya's Emulating Inferno, the former dealing 4 damage to each player, and the latter being a legendary X spell that deals X damage to up to 3 targets, making them both excellent means to inflict direct damage to our opponent's life totals, with the former dealing a fifth of the table's starting life total when empowered for only 2 mana, and the latter being scalable to nuke all 3 of our opponent's life pools, or, in a pinch, can be used as targeted removal instead to deal with troublesome creatures or walkers. The second half of this slot then brings us a pair of Impulse Draw spells in the form of Reckless Impulse and Ren's Resolve, both of which have us exile the top 2 cards of our deck and let us play those cards until the end of our next turn, serving as cheap sources of card advantage in our colors to help dig deeper into our deck for more resources, and despite being Impulse Draw, do give us an extra turn to cast those spells just in case we need it. The CMC3 slot then opens up with another Impulse Draw spell, Light Up the Stage, which also has us exile the top 2 cards of our deck and lets us play them until the end of our next turn, as well as having Spectacle for a red, generally allowing us to cast it for a single red considering how much burn we have at our disposal so we can continue cheaply digging through our deck for more resources. We're then pivoting back to burn spells for the remainder of this slot with its last 3 entrants, Acidic Soil, Slagstorm, and Browbeat. Acidic Soil deals 1 damage to each player for each land they control, serving as a great burn spell for us in the late game that would normally hit for 7+ damage on its own with players just making their normal land drops, but skyrocketing past that with our commander in play to deal upwards of a third or even a full half of our opponent's starting life totals in a single blow. Slagstorm either lets us deal 3 damage to each creature or each player, making it a flexible spell that gives us the option to either retake control of the board with it as a wipe, or to pile on the damage even further by using it as an AoE burn spell instead. Browbeat lets any player take 5 damage and, if no one does, has target player draw 3 cards, generally forcing one of our opponents to either take 10+ damage to the face after its damage has been empowered, or let us get significant card advantage off of it, with either result being a win-win for us. Then moving on to the CMC 4 slot, we have our second to last sorcery entry joining us, Fiery Confluence, which has us choose 3 of the following effects, which we can choose more than once: deal 1 damage to each creature, deal 2 damage to each opponent, and or destroy target artifact, which 9 times out of 10 we'll be using to deal 12 damage to each opponent alongside Solphim, but the wipe and back row removal still being useful to have in our back pocket just in case we need them. Then skipping all the way to the CMC 9 slot, we have our last sorcery entry, Blasphemous Act, which costs 1 less to cast for each creature in play and deals 13 damage to each creature, making it a deceptively cheap board wipe that our indestructible commander can tank, that also combines with our handful of damage redirection sources to turn it into an impressive burn spell as well. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Skipping straight into the CMC 2 slot, we have Roiling Vortex as its singular entry, which, on each player's upkeep, deals 1 damage to them, deals 5 damage to a player whenever they cast a spell without spending mana for it, and it lets us pay a red to prevent our opponents from gaining life that turn. The passive burn and life gain prevention it provides helping us soften up our opponents while simultaneously keeping them from recovering, and its conditional burn against manaless spells, while niche, is a potent silver bullet against Cascade, Cheerios, and other archetypes that use and abuse free or 0 mana spells. The CMC 3 slot then brings us some more passive burn with its opening trio of entrants, Descent into Avernus, Sulfuric Vortex, and Valakut Exploration. Descent into Avernus, on our upkeep, has us put 2 descent counters on it, then has each player create X treasure tokens and take X damage, where X is equal to the number of descent counters on it. Putting the entire table on a clock as soon as it comes down, that's twice as fast for our opponents, and lets us stockpile the mana we need to pump into our burn spells and finish them off even faster. Sulfuric Vortex, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, deals 2 damage to that player, and prevents players from gaining life, again providing some passive burn to our opponents equivalent to a free Pulse of the Forge each turn while we're only being shocked, and shutting down any healing our opponents may attempt to do to stabilize themselves against our burn, which would otherwise be problematic. Valakut Exploration, whenever a land ETBs under our control, has us exile the top card of our deck, letting us play that card until the end of the turn, and, if we don't, returns all cards exiled with it to our graveyard and deals that much damage to each opponent, giving us another source of impulse draw that this time we can turn into burn in the event we hit lands, dead cards, or just want to inflict more damage. We then close out this slot with Mechanized Warfare, which, whenever a red or artifact source we control would deal damage to an opponent or permanent they control, has it deal that much damage +1 instead, serving as some nice and simple damage amplification to work alongside Solphim that works from the relative safety of our back row, where hopefully our opponents won't be able to get to it. Then nearing the end of our enchantments, we'll be skipping to the CMC 5 slot to view its 2 entries, Port of Ire and Dictate of the Twin Gods. Port of Ire makes us the Monarch when it ETBs, and, on our upkeep, either deals 2 damage to any target, or 7 damage instead if we're the Monarch. The passive draw it provides by giving us the Crown being nice, considering we have a 5/4 indestructible blocker to defend it for us, which coincidentally also makes it easier for us to hold on to the Crown for full rotations and deal a shattering 14 damage to someone each turn if they can't get it away from us, or 4 damage instead if they can, which is still serviceable. Dictate of the Twin Gods has Flash, and, if a source would deal damage to a player or permanent, has it deal double that damage instead, giving us another means to further double our damage output that, while symmetrical, lets us cast it on our opponent's turns before it gets back to us to set up powerful Nova turns that will hopefully end the game on the spot before our opponents are able to take advantage of it. Then jumping all the way to the CMC 8 slot and our ultimate enchantment, we have City on Fire, which has Convoke, and, if a source we control would deal damage to a permanent or player, has it deal triple that damage instead, It's Convoke, allowing us to use our spell payoff creatures that we won't be attacking in with anyway to help cast it, thus freeing up our actual mana for our burn spells, and its damage tripling effect turning into 6-fold damage amplification alongside Solphim, ensuring that even our smallest burn spells are dealing roughly over a quarter of our opponent's life totals, and our bigger AoE burn sources can take the entire table from 40 to 0 in a single shot. Though we will have to be careful with effects that damage us, since that damage will be tripled as well. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. It's going to be ramp all the way down in this category, with a CMC onslaught bringing us Soul Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble. The former tapping for 2 colorless, and the latter letting us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, each providing cheap and efficient ramp to help get Solphim on board as quickly as possible to begin empowering our burn spells. The CMC 2 slot then brings us even more ramp with a Mana Rock collection consisting of Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Felwar Stone, which taps for any mana an opponent's land would be able to produce, Fire Diamond, which comes into play tapped and taps for a red, and Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and lets us pay 1, tap it and sack it to draw a card, again giving us access to more cheap and efficient ramp sources to help speed up our mana base even further. Then skipping all the way to the CMC 5 slot and onto our final artifact entry and rock, we have Pyromancer's Goggles, which taps for a red and, if we use that mana to cast an instant or sorcery, copies that spell, which may be expensive for a rock but does make a full quarter of our deck's burn spells twice as efficient, many of which whose damage output is already being doubled by our commander, which ultimately makes it well worth running. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Jumping right into the CMC 4 slot, our first pair of Planeswalker entries will be a pair of Chandras, those being Chandra Fire Artisan and Chandra Torch of Defiance. Chandra Fire Artisan comes into play with 4 loyalty and has the following abilities. For her passive, whenever 1 or more loyalty counters are removed from her, she deals that much damage to target opponent or planeswalker. Her +1 exiles a top card of our deck and lets us play it until the end of the turn, and her -7 has us exile the top 7 cards of our deck and lets us play them until the end of the turn, making her a repeatable source of impulse draw that our indestructible commander can screen attacks for, and, even if they bypass her, still deals upwards of 10 burn to them if they take her out, or 14 instead if they allow her to get to her ult, either of which suit us just fine. Chandra Torch of Defiance also comes into play with 4 loyalty and has the following abilities. Her first +1 exiles a top card of our deck and lets us cast it, dealing 2 damage to each opponent if we don't. Her second +1 adds double red to our mana pool. Her -3 deals 4 damage to target creature, and her -7 gives us an emblem that, whenever we cast a spell, deals 5 damage to any target, providing us with card advantage, ramp, and removal all in one convenient package, as well as a back-breaking ult that will tack on 10 extra damage alongside Solphim to every spell we cast to quickly burn out our opponents. Then taking up the last spot in the CMC 4 slot, we have Koth, Fire of Resistance, who comes into play with 4 loyalty as well and has the following abilities. His +1 lets us search our deck for a mountain and put it into our hand. His -3 deals damage to target creature equal to the number of mountains we control, and his -7 gives us an emblem that, whenever a mountain ETBs under our control, deals 4 damage to any target. This time providing our build with a reliable way for us to make our land drops, decent creature removal that scales well with our monocolored build, and another burn-oriented ultimate that adds an 8 damage rider to every land drop we make so we can keep piling on the damage. And finally, skipping to the CMC 6 slot, we have our final Planeswalker, Chandra Hope's Beacon, who comes into play with 5 loyalty and has the following abilities. For her passive, whenever we cast an instant or sorcery, we copy it, limited to once per turn. Her +2 adds 2 mana of any combination of colors to our mana pool. Her +1 exiles the top 5 cards of our deck and lets us cast an instant or sorcery from among them until the end of our next turn, and her -X deals X damage to up to 2 targets, providing our build with another passive way for us to double up on our most common burn spells to get even more damage in, on top of giving us more ramp, card advantage, and additional targeted damage to further improve our core stats and our primary game plan as well. That covers all our Planeswalkers, so let's move on to our battles. The first of two battles we'll be fighting comes to us in the CMC3 slot, that being Invasion of Ragatha. A siege that comes into play with 5 defense. When it ETBs, deals 4 damage to target battle or opponent and 1 damage to up to 1 target creature, and, when defeated, transforms into Disciples of the Inferno. A 4/4 with prowess, which, whenever a non-creature source we control would deal damage to a creature, battle, or opponent, has it deal that much damage +2 instead. Its front face being a passable burn spell with removal attached when empowered by Solphim, and its back face, which our commander can get to in a single swing, is another potent damage amplifier that allows more than a third of our deck to burn even hotter. Then our second and last battle comes to us in the CMC4 slot in the form of Invasion of Karsus, another siege that this time comes into play with 4 defense. When it ETBs, deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, and, when defeated, transforms into Refraction Elemental, a 4/4 with ward, pay 2 life, and, whenever we cast a spell, deals 2 damage to each opponent, initially making it a decent wipe that clears the way for our commander to attack into it, that then turns into a gutter snipe that triggers off all our spells, giving us one last spell-based form of burn for us to take advantage of. That covers all our battles, so let's move on to our land base. Starting off with our one and only mana land, we have Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and lets us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped, giving us a land-based ramp source in our colors, which is a rarity, and whose downside doesn't affect us in the slightest since we're a mono-colored deck anyway. Then as our singular utility land, we have Shivan Gorge, which taps for a colorless and lets us pay 2 a red and tap it to have it deal 1 damage to each opponent, capping off our AoE burn sources with one last one from our land slot if we find ourselves with the mana to spare to use it. And lastly, we're running 34 mountains as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 18 creatures including the commander, 12 instants, 13 sorceries, 8 enchantments, 7 artifacts, 4 planeswalkers, 2 battles, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 43 sources of non-combat damage, 40 sources of burn, 4 cards that care about non-combat damage, 6 cards that care about damage in general, 7 cards that amplify damage, and 2 cards that copy our spells, giving us a huge array of damaging effects for our commander to empower, most of which hit or can hit our opponents in the face, payoffs for our damage dealing to deal even more damage, further ways to empower our damage alongside our commander so we can burn our opponents even more effectively, and capping off with a small handful of ways to repeatedly copy our spells to get a bit more mileage out of them as we use them to burn through our opponents' life totals. For general deck stats, we have 15 ramp sources, 13 card draw sources, 16 targeted removal sources, and 7 board wipes. Our ramp and draw being slightly above average in this build since we want to be casting and digging for our burn spells quickly once we get Solphim into play, our targeted removal also being high since a lot of our burn spells can also hit creatures if we need them to, and our wipes being completely off the charts since we're running a lot of AoE burn sources that just so happen to hit creatures as well, which luckily our typically indestructible commander won't have to worry about since they're all damage based. Then looking at our mana curve, we have 7 1-drops, 19 2-drops, 15 3-drops, 13 4-drops, 5 5-drops, 2 6-drops, 1 7-drop, 1 8-drop, and 1 9-drop, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that aims to drop Solphim into play as soon as possible and ideally make her indestructible on that same turn rotation before it gets back to us, at which point we can sit back with our incredibly resilient commander, with her empowering all our burn and intercepting any attacks that come our way, until our flames become too hot for our opponent's life totals to handle. Currently this deck is valued at $64.89, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, we can swap out Smash to Smithereens for Harsh Mentor to passively inflict more burn onto our opponents as they use their non-mana abilities at the cost of reducing our removal suite. Big Score can be traded out for Mana Barbs as another very reliable source of passive burn that will punish players for generating mana off of their lands, though our card selection and ramp will suffer. And Electro Dominance can be exchanged for Flame Break if we'd rather have another AoE burn/wipe in our arsenal to maintain control of the board while burning our opponents over the single target burn/removal and free spell of its predecessor. Then for upgrades, Defiler of Instinct can be cut for Pyrohemia, which provides the build with a relatively cheap mana sink we can pump mana into to inflict AoE burn to players and damage their creatures to both stay on game plan while maintaining control of the board. Slagstorm can be removed to make room for Delayed Blast Fireball, which at base is a decent opponent-only AoE damage and burn spell, but can take advantage of our plethora of impulse draw effects to empower itself significantly for even more damage. And one of our spare mountains can be terraformed into Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, allowing us to weaponize our land drops as well to ensure that our opponents are taking damage no matter what we do on our turn. And lastly, we can cut the damage amplifying Mechanized Warfare and Dictate of the Twin Gods for the powerful repeatable burn spell Repercussion and the even better damage amplifier Fiery Emancipation, the former doubling the effectiveness of all our AoE damage dealing wipes by also inflicting that damage to players' faces, and the latter tripling any damage we inflict from any of our sources, making them both superb additions that will burn through our opponent's life totals as quickly as they will burn through the cash in our wallets if we're planning on running them. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. It looks like after a very successful 10k giveaway, the channel has just crossed the 12k subscriber threshold, so I would like to take a moment to thank all of the channel's loyal subscribers for having helped us get to this point. Thank you all for your continued support, for having helped us get to this milestone and hopefully reach even greater milestones in the future. And speaking of the 10k giveaway, if you entered, be sure to check if you're the lucky winner either via the card in the video or in the link in the description, as so far the winner has not reached out to claim their prize. Then moving on to upcoming deck builds, with Solphim covered, it's time for us to move on to our first non-precon commander builds for March of the Machine, with our very first build featuring the legendary duo of Rashmi and Ravagon, so look forward to a spell-stealing artifact themed build featuring this pair next week. Then proceeding to the results of last week's poll, it looks like the enormous Yargle and Multani were able to claim the top spot, so expect to see a build spec'd around their massive 18 power coming soon. Then arriving at this week's poll, it's about time we give the newly completed Phyrexians a shot at the ballot, with this week's contenders being a Yara Widow of the Realm, Perlukranos Reborn, and Heliod the Radiant Dawn, which transform into a Yara Furnace Queen, Perlukranos Engine of Ruin, and Heliod the Warped Eclipse respectively. So please cast your votes in the community tab, link in the description, before the deadline on May 12th, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders from March of the Machine you want to see me cover in future polls. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. And speaking of which, I would like to thank @Halden Lucero for their generous donation. Thanks for the coffee @Halden Lucero, and thank you for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.